Tonight, a great city without a dependable river survives because you are carrying yesterday's rain through the dry season. Tikal's tall temples may command the skyline, but the household jar commands you, and it has selected the longest path home. If evenings of history honestly suit you, you may like or subscribe, and tell me where you are listening and your local time. Let the room grow dim, settle in a comfortable way, and step into the central Maya lowlands during the 8th century. You are an adult resident of Tikal, standing beside an empty ceramic vessel before sunrise. The cook needs water, a craft task waits, and the stored rain at Corriental reservoir is not going to climb back to the house by itself. Before you lift it, the day has already begun. The jar is not enormous, which is fortunate, because an enormous jar would be a building problem rather than a water problem. It is still heavy enough when empty to make you inspect the carrying strap twice. The household has other vessels, but this one has a mouth narrow enough to cover and a body broad enough to justify the walk. Archaeology cannot give us your name, your exact doorway, or the amount your household drew on this morning. You are a careful composite built from the city's reservoirs, ceramic vessels, paths, kitchens, and ordinary needs. The task itself is secure. A city of many people required water each day, and in the dry season that water came chiefly from rain saved months before. The vessel has no interest in being underestimated. Carrying capacity was a household decision before it was an engineering one. A jar large enough to save a second trip is also a jar heavy enough to make the first one memorable. You leave the residential cluster while the stone underfoot is still cool. Roof edges, courtyard surfaces, and broad paved spaces slope so gently that a person crossing them might notice the direction only after a storm. Their purpose becomes clearer when rain falls. Water runs from plastered surfaces into channels and toward basins cut and built into the landscape. For now, the surfaces are pale and dry. Dust settles where runoff once moved. You follow the lower route toward Corriental, carrying the vessel against one hip and keeping the strap from twisting. Other adults are moving too, some with jars, some with baskets, some toward work areas. No surviving whist records this particular procession. It is the ordinary human traffic required by the water system the excavated city reveals. Morning traffic keeps moving around you. Tikal spread widely rather than clustering tight, so the walk between a house and its water was an ordinary daily distance rather than an inconvenience worth remarking on. Tikal stands on porous limestone in a karst landscape. Rain can arrive heavily and then disappear downward or away, leaving little permanent surface water behind. There is no dependable river beside the city, and no nearby lake that can be visited whenever a household jar grows light. The groundwater lies far below the surface, beyond the reach of wells the classic period city could use. That combination turns the wet season into a season of collection, and the dry months into a long exercise in memory. Every full basin contains an earlier storm. Every carried jar is a delayed piece of weather. You do not need a map of the whole system to understand the immediate rule. The water available now depends on work completed before the sky cleared. The limestone keeps its water hidden. Modern excavators met the same problem. A deep test well driven through the limestone failed to reach water at all, which is a blunt confirmation of what every household here already arranged its day around. Groundwater here lies far below any reachable depth, so the aquifer might as well not exist. The city's entire supply had to be caught on the way down. The path descends toward a reservoir placed beyond the most crowded monumental core. Corriental is not simply a natural pond with a convenient name. Excavation and sediment study show a long history of modification, use, and care. Its position differs from the temple and palace reservoirs nearer the great plazas. Those central basins received runoff from broad architectural surfaces and served a different part of the city. Corriental gathered water through its own catchment and, at times, through filtering material placed where water entered. The differences matter. Tikal did not rely on one identical bowl repeated across the landscape. It relied on a network, and each part had a history that workers had to learn. That varied history will matter at every turn of the path. 5 reservoirs in this southern half of the center have been studied closely, and they do not share one biography. Each was built, altered, and used on its own schedule. You reach the approach while the sun begins to touch the upper stonework behind you. A few people are already near the water. The exact rules of access are not preserved, so no official appears to issue a perfectly measured allowance. Yet a reservoir serving an urban population could not have been treated as an accidental puddle. Paths, stairs, retaining works, and the position of water features suggest managed spaces. You wait long enough for the person ahead to steady a jar. Waiting with an empty vessel is simple. Waiting with a full one requires the particular dignity of someone pretending the liquid is not shifting with every breath. Today you have only the first half of that problem. Everyone near the approach makes room through practiced attention, not a recovered regulation. Access routes near the central waterworks could be watched or restricted, though what that supervision actually looked like on an ordinary morning is not something the excavated stone can tell you. At the edge, you look before dipping. The water level has fallen since the rains. A band on the reservoir margin marks the higher season, and damp earth gives way to firmer ground above it. Sediment is the quiet enemy of stored water. Every storm can bring grit, leaves, and organic matter. Every dry month concentrates what remains. Tikal's waterworks included settling areas, shaped inlets, and channels intended to slow or direct incoming flow. These features did not make maintenance unnecessary. They made maintenance possible. You choose a place where the water can be reached without stirring the bottom. The vessel is lowered carefully, not because anyone has declared a ceremony, but because mud carried home is still mud. A careful dip protects the water still waiting for those behind you. Nobody has to explain this. The person behind you will draw from the same surface within a minute, and the courtesy is entirely practical. Corriental holds one of the most striking pieces of evidence in the city's water story. Its sediments contain coarse crystalline quartz and natural zeolites, minerals that can trap contaminants and clarify water. Researchers traced likely source material to a region roughly 30 kilometers northeast of Tikal. The exact container that held the material has vanished. It may have been supported by woven or wooden elements that decayed long ago. What remains is the mineral pattern, the dated layers, and the placement consistent with filtering incoming water. The evidence belongs to this reservoir, not automatically to every basin in the city. You do not know the mineral names. You know that water arriving by this route has passed through a place people deliberately prepared. The useful certainty is deliberate filtration, while the missing framework remains honestly missing. The minerals themselves are not local. A likely source lies roughly 30 kilometers to the northeast, which means somebody carried filtration material a long way on purpose. Radiocarbon and stratigraphic place the filtration material in use from the late pre-classic into the late classic, which is centuries of somebody deciding it was worth replacing. The jar fills with a low hollow sound. Air leaves in uneven bubbles, and you turn the mouth slightly so the water enters without pulling up more sediment than necessary. A lid or cover can reduce the chance of leaves and dust joining the load on the way home. Your hands work through a routine that archaeology rarely preserves directly. Ceramic vessels survive. Reservoirs survive. Wear on paths survives in fragments. The exact grip of one adult on one morning does not. It is plausible staging, kept close to the physical demands of the task. When the vessel is full, the abstract phrase water management becomes weight. The city has collected the rain, but your shoulder has been appointed to manage the final distance. Your fingers feel only weight, coolness, and the rim. The sound changes as the level rises, and you stop by ear rather than by looking. It is a small skill nobody would think to name. You test the strap before lifting. One hand supports the vessel while the other settles the load. The first steps are slow because a full jar changes every slope. Water rises on one side, returns on the other, and reminds you that it has no interest in your preferred rhythm. A person passing downhill gives space. Another adjusts a smaller container. The traffic around a reservoir is not a list of anonymous consumers. It is a sequence of households, kitchens, workshops, and bodies. Some needs are immediate. Some can wait. None can be answered by a reservoir that is full but unreachable, contaminated, or neglected. Storage is only one part of survival. Access, carrying, covering, and careful use complete the system. The covered load now contains both water and the cost of reaching it. A cover is not decoration. Between here and the house the jar will pass dust, insects, and a dozen opportunities to collect something nobody wants in the evening meal. The climb begins gently, then becomes less interested in gentleness. You lean forward and shorten your stride. Heat gathers along the path, and the covered jar presses against the strap. Tikal's builders shaped large surfaces to move water downhill, a fact that becomes slightly unfair when you are moving the water uphill again. The city does not reverse gravity for household convenience. It arranges the landscape to collect rain efficiently, then leaves the return journey to human legs. You pause where the path widens, not from crisis, but from good judgment. A spilled jar would waste the water and repeat the walk. A pause costs only a minute and allows the load to stop arguing with your balance. Breath returns, the strap settles, and you begin climbing again. The reservoir sits below the crowded core, which is convenient for collecting rain and inconvenient for everyone carrying it back up. Water flows downhill, households do not. The basins sit where water wanted to collect. The households sit where people wanted to live. The gap between those two preferences is carried on somebody's shoulder. From the higher ground, you can understand the catchment more clearly. Plazas and courtyards are not flat in the careless sense. Many are paved, plastered, and canted so runoff travels towards selected edges. During a storm, water moves across spaces used for ceremony, residence, work, and passage, then enters channels or reservoirs. The same monumental core that appears to be made for stone display also acts as a collector. This does not mean every roof or plaza fed every basin, or that all runoff remained clean. Different catchments carried different risks. The important point is that Tikal's built landscape helped turn seasonal rainfall into stored supply. The city was not waiting beside a river. It was teaching rain where to go. Every surface turns architecture into part of the seasonal water supply. The city was not waiting beside a river. It was teaching rain where to go. That shallow tilt is the difference between rain that leaves the city and rain the city keeps. Mapping, coring, and excavation traced the catchment as one integrated system rather than a scatter of separate tanks. The surfaces and the basins were built to belong to each other. You continue past a junction where one route climbs toward the central precinct and another bends toward residential groups. The great reservoirs nearer temples and palaces were convenient for people working and living in the core. Their convenience also exposed them to whatever washed from busy surfaces. Later sediment shows that temple and palace reservoirs accumulated high levels of phosphate, mercury, and toxin-producing cyanobacteria during parts of the late and terminal classic periods. Corriental shows fewer of those contamination signals. The contrast warns against telling one simple story about Tikal's water. A reservoir could be well placed and heavily used, yet become vulnerable because of the very activity around it. Another could be farther away and better protected. Source, location, and history therefore shape every decision about what may be drawn. Temple and palace sit high and central, close to authority and close to everything that drains from it. Corriental lies further out, and that distance turns out to matter. Nothing about the network was uniform. Position, construction, use, and water quality all differed from one basin to the next, and a carrier had to know which was which. You do not see mercury, phosphate, or ancient DNA. Those are modern measurements from sediment. The useful aside is brief, and then your next step still matters. You keep the lid tight as a gust moves dry leaves across the path. Invisible contaminants were not the only concern. Dust, insects, stirred mud, and decaying matter were immediate and observable. People could judge smell, color, surface growth, and taste, though we cannot recover every decision they made. The temptation is to imagine either perfect knowledge or complete helplessness. The evidence supports neither. You live in a city with long experience of stored water, and you work with what sight, custom, and the condition of each source can tell you. Observation guides the carrier even when the chemistry remains hidden. Color, smell, and the memory of last season are the instruments available. They are better than nothing and worse than knowing, which is the ordinary condition of anyone drinking stored water. At a shaded place, you shift the jar from one carrying position to another. The movement is practiced, but never entirely graceful. Water has made the vessel heavier than the household's most optimistic estimate. A child watches from a doorway, though the work remains adult responsibility in this story. Nearby, someone sweeps a plastered surface, moving loose debris away from a path where rain will later run. Even in the dry season, the wet season is present as preparation. A channel blocked now will not politely clear itself when the first storm arrives. Your own task and the sweeper's task belong to the same system, separated by time. One preserves today's stored water. The other protects water that has not yet fallen. The two preparations meet without either worker needing to explain the connection. One of you is protecting water already collected. The other is protecting the surface that will collect the next lot. Neither task makes much sense alone. The household comes into view, and the cook meets you before you reach the doorway. The water is not poured at once. First, the outside of the vessel is checked for mud. The cover is lifted without dropping dust inside. A smaller amount is transferred for immediate use, while the rest remains protected. The exact household arrangement is reconstructed, not excavated as a complete scene, yet controlled pouring follows from scarcity. Water needed for drinking and food preparation could not be treated as though the next river were around the corner. The vessel's narrow mouth helps. So does the habit of not placing an open jar where ash, insects, or a passing elbow can improve the morning in the wrong direction. Saving the clean supply begins before any of it reaches the cooking bowl. The cook has been managing this since before you were trusted with the strap. What arrives clean stays clean only through a sequence of small refusals. A portion goes toward preparing maize. Another is reserved for drinking. A little may be needed to dampen material for craft work or clean a necessary surface. We cannot assign a precise number of cups to each activity, nor can we assume every household had the same access, labor, or storage. Tikal spread across a broad urban landscape of monumental groups, residential compounds, fields, paths, and managed forest. Distance alone could make water easier for one household and harder for another. Social position likely shaped convenience as well, especially near central reservoirs. The jar on your floor is therefore both ordinary and political. It is ordinary because someone must cook. It is political because the city must decide, build, and maintain where water can be reached. Each measured use carries a different urgency, and none is entirely optional. Where water can be reached at all was settled generations ago by people planning basins and channels. What happens to it after that is settled in this courtyard, one pour at a time. Maintaining urban life at this scale was bound up with political organization. Somebody had to keep deciding the basins were worth the labor they demanded. You sit for a moment while the cook covers the remaining water. The walk has paid off the title in its most human form. Tikal survived without a dependable nearby river because its people collected seasonal rain from roofs, plazas, slopes, and catchments, guided it into a varied reservoir network, controlled sediment, and at Corriental used quartz and zeolite to filter incoming water. Then people carried it, protected it, and spent it carefully. No single device solved the problem. The answer was a city shaped around rainfall and a chain of repeated labor. The temples did not drink, the reservoirs did not cook. Between the storm and the meal stood many adults doing small tasks correctly. The answer is practical, distributed, and repeated often enough to sustain daily life. There is no single clever device at the center of it. The city survives because a great many people each did something small and correct in the right order. The first measure of water darkens ground maize in a bowl. You add slowly because a wet mixture can be adjusted only by adding more dry material, and that creates another task, with no particular respect for the morning schedule. The cook folds the dough while you steady the vessel. A second container receives water for drinking, covered as soon as it is filled. The household's practical choices reveal something a map of reservoirs cannot. Water had several qualities and several destinations. The cleanest available supply was valuable for the body and the pot. Water of lower quality might still serve plaster, clay, washing, or plants, depending on circumstance. Archaeology can identify facilities and residues more readily than it can reconstruct every household hierarchy of use, so the distinctions remain cautious rather than exact. Facilities and residues survive more readily than rules. We can see where water was used and struggle to say who was entitled to how much of it. A craft worker in the courtyard needs moisture for clay. You carry a small bowl, not the main jar, and watch the surface of the clay change under the first drops. Ceramic production, plaster work, food preparation, and cleaning all consumed water in an inland city. None required a dramatic flood. Their demand accumulated through repeated small measures. One bowl here, one rinse there, one dampened surface somewhere else. The reservoir network had to serve this dispersed pressure while losing water to heat, seepage, spills, and sediment. The porous limestone below Tikal made natural surface storage difficult, but plastered basins and built retaining works created places where rain could remain. Maintenance transformed a temporary downpour into months of useful decisions. Even a modest craft bowl joins the larger account of stored rain. Clay needs moisture whether or not the season is generous. The craft worker's bowl is drawn from the same months-old storm as the cooking pot. The sun is higher now, and the courtyard edge becomes bright. You move the covered jar farther from the doorway, where traffic is less likely to strike it. This is imaginative staging, but it rests on an uncomplicated material truth. A stored supply is safest when the container is shaded, covered, stable, and known to the people using it. The grand citywide system narrows into household habits. No overseer can prevent a careless scoop from bringing dirt into a jar. No dam can stop a vessel from cracking. Tikal's survival depended on infrastructure at several scales, from dams and plazas to lids and hands. The smallest scale leaves the least direct evidence, yet it completes the chain without which the larger works have no daily purpose. The habit protects a resource whose replacement still requires another journey. Every avoidable loss converts directly into another walk downhill and another climb back. The arithmetic is immediate and personal. Later, you walk to a nearby courtyard with the empty carrying strap over one shoulder. The route crosses a paved surface that seems almost level until you notice a shallow line where sediment gathers. During rain, the same slight tilt moves water. Engineers and workers did not need steep channels everywhere. They used the form of the hill, modified depressions, built walls, and laid plaster so gravity could perform part of the labor. The urban core rose above surrounding seasonal wetlands called bajos, but those low areas did not provide a simple permanent drinking supply. The city occupied high ground and had to manage the water that arrived from the sky. Its location offered advantages for settlement and defense, yet demanded a patient answer to every dry season. Water follows the surface patiently, whether anyone crossing the courtyard notices or not. The interior setting gave the city defensible ground and workable soils, and no river at all. Every advantage arrived attached to that one standing problem. Tikal supported a large, low-density population for centuries by combining farming, tree cultivation, and water management. No single one of those would have been sufficient alone. At the courtyard, an older vessel has developed a damp line near its base. The leak is small enough to inspire hope and steady enough to defeat it. You place the vessel inside a shallow bowl while someone prepares a patch or decides whether the jar can be reassigned to a less demanding use. A leaking container is not evidence of failed civilization. It is evidence that pottery behaves like pottery. Household storage depended on objects that could chip, crack, and be repaired or replaced. Excavated ceramic fragments are abundant, partly because vessels had working lives. The water problem was therefore also a material problem involving clay, firing, covers, cords, stands, and the judgment to notice a fault before the floor became the reservoir. Someone notices the damp line before the loss becomes larger. A vessel that seeps slowly is worse than one that cracks outright, because nothing announces it. The loss simply appears as water that was there yesterday. You return to the main jar and find the level lower by a sensible amount. Food has been prepared. People have drunk. A surface has been cleaned. The water has not vanished mysteriously. It has entered the day's work. This is the difference between capacity and usefulness. Archaeologists can estimate how much a basin might hold, but a reservoir volume does not translate neatly into a number of people sustained. Rainfall varies. Evaporation varies. Seepage, sediment, access, irrigation, and water quality vary. Population estimates for Tikal also vary. The honest conclusion is not a single impressive total. It is that a large urban population depended on storage enough to invest repeatedly in reservoirs, catchments, dams, and maintenance across many centuries. Capacity becomes meaningful only after people turn stored volume into careful daily use. The basins were enlarged and altered across centuries, rather than dug once to a finished plan. What you draw from today is the accumulated result of a very long argument with the landscape. The temple, palace, and hidden basins form a chain with dams between them, which means water could be moved and held rather than only collected where it fell. The dry season lengthens the value of every past storm. Regional rainfall is strongly seasonal, with months of little or no rain. The exact start and end shift from year to year, and modern averages cannot be copied directly onto one ancient season. Still, reservoir sediments and climate records confirm that dry intervals mattered, while longer droughts could place the whole system under strain. You do not need to foresee a multi-year climate episode to notice a falling water line. A household sees the change in fewer dips of the jar, longer walks, or more attention to the source. Citywide stress arrives through ordinary measurements long before it becomes a chapter in a history book. The household reads the season through the changing effort required to fill ordinary containers. Nobody consults a record. The season is measured in how far you walk and how long you wait at the edge. In the afternoon, you carry a smaller vessel toward a neighbor whose household has lent a tool. The exchange is not recorded, but sharing objects and labor is plausible within residential groups. You do not present water as freely abundant or as a fixed state ration. The evidence does not reveal a universal distribution rule. Instead, distance, social ties, household storage, work obligations, and access to particular reservoirs likely shaped what people could obtain. At the central basins, architecture may have made supervision easier. At peripheral sources, different arrangements may have prevailed. The city had authority without becoming a modern utility office. Its water landscape was social, because people had to negotiate space, timing, upkeep, and need. Access is therefore lived through relationships and routes, not through one reconstructed rule. Timing, space at the edge, and whose turn it is gets settled between neighbors. None of that negotiation left anything for an excavator to find. The neighbor's courtyard has a shallow plastered area being repaired. Water is needed to mix material, but drinking water is not poured without thought. A lesser quality supply may be used when available, though the exact source cannot be assigned. You watch the worker add only enough moisture to make the mixture workable. Lime plaster protected floors, walls, catchments, and reservoir surfaces. Producing and renewing it required fuel, stone, water, and labor. The white surfaces that guided runoff were not permanent, simply because they looked solid. Heat, roots, traffic, and water itself could open cracks. The city that caught rain had to spend water in order to maintain the surfaces that caught rain. A circular obligation managed one patch at a time. The fresh surface joins city maintenance to the needs of a neighboring household. The same skill patches a courtyard and a catchment. A household repairing its own paving is quietly maintaining a small piece of the city's water supply. As the patch is smoothed, a few grains of grit are pushed to the edge. If left in a runoff line, such material can travel with the next storm. Sediment control basins and channels reduce that movement, but people still have to clear what accumulates. Excavation at Tikal documented siltation features and modifications associated with directing water. Some control devices are reconstructed from masonry in channel form, because wood and other perishable parts did not survive. It is reasonable to picture workers watching flow and clearing inlets. It is not reasonable to claim we know the exact lever, schedule, or command shouted during a storm. The system is sophisticated without requiring invented machinery. Workers remove the grit because future flow will otherwise carry it into deeper storage. Grit is patient. Left at the edge, it waits for the first heavy runoff and then travels exactly where nobody wants it, into the part of the basin hardest to clear. You leave the repaired courtyard as the new plaster begins to firm. On the path, broad-leaved trees cast broken shade near lower ground. Environmental DNA recovered from reservoir sediments shows that Tikal's water margins supported diverse trees and vegetation. This corrects the picture of bare stone basins surrounded only by monuments. Plants may have stabilized soil, moderated edges, and contributed to the ecology of the reservoir. Yet the evidence cannot tell us that every tree was planted according to one plan. Some were maintained, some tolerated, some naturally present. The safer image is a managed urban landscape where water, masonry, and vegetation met. Not a rigid garden copied around every basin. The reservoir margin holds evidence of care without offering a complete ancient planting plan. Sediment DNA has identified a genuine variety of trees around these waters. What it cannot recover is whether any particular tree was chosen, tolerated, or simply arrived. A modern scholarly proposal compares some ancient Maya reservoirs with constructed wetlands. Aquatic plants, microbes, and small organisms can remove nutrients and help keep still water usable. The model is plausible and supported by several kinds of evidence across the Maya lowlands, but it remains an interpretation. You do not place a named plant into Corriental merely because it would make a pleasing scene. The mineral filter there is direct evidence. Vegetated margins at Tikal are supported. A complete planting diagram is not. Your next action remains simple. You step around roots near the path, rather than turning a current hypothesis into an ancient instruction manual. Possibility remains possibility, while the worker continues along a path supported by firmer evidence. The distinction keeps imagination useful without allowing it to harden into unsupported architectural detail. A model that explains something is not the same as a design that was followed. The proposal is worth taking seriously and worth holding loosely. Back at the household, the main jar holds enough for the evening. You pour a measured amount into a cooking vessel and stop before the surface reaches the rim. The cook adds ingredients already prepared. Steam rises slowly, carrying the familiar smell of maize and other foods whose exact combination we need not invent. Water changes texture, releases flavor, softens grain, and makes a meal possible. It also leaves the household through steam, washing, and bodies. Nothing in the daily cycle returns automatically to the covered jar. Tomorrow's needs will require tomorrow's decisions, perhaps another walk, perhaps another source, perhaps help from someone whose turn it is to carry. Every quantity that enters the pot is a quantity no longer waiting in storage. Water placed in the meal completes a purpose that began with rain crossing distant plaster. The distance between that plaster and this pot is the whole story of the city, compressed into an evening's cooking. The title's phrase, "survived without a river," can sound as though the city performed one brilliant trick and then rested. Your day shows the opposite. Tikal's water system worked through repetition. Rain fell seasonally. Built surfaces directed it. Basins stored it. Filters and cephaloning features improved some incoming water. Workers repaired the infrastructure. Households carried and protected the supply. Each link could be ordinary, tiring, and vulnerable. Together they allowed urban life on high ground where permanent surface water was scarce. The achievement was not the absence of dependence. It was the creation of a different dependence, one tied to weather, planning, authority, material care, and the reliability of many people. That dependence is managed through habits rather than solved once and forgotten. The dependence remains resilient only while many linked actions continue through changing seasons. Nothing here was solved, it was maintained, which is a different and much more demanding achievement. Rainfall here is strongly seasonal. Surviving the dry months was never about finding water, but about having kept enough of it from months earlier. Toward evening, you rinse one small utensil over a separate bowl rather than over the open storage jar. The used water is carried away from the clean container. We cannot claim a single Tikal household rule, but the action illustrates the general problem of protecting stored water from immediate contamination. At the scale of a reservoir, refuse and water could also matter. Near Palace Reservoir, a kitchen and midden left chemical traces in sediment. Convenience brought risk, because activity close to the water sent organic material into runoff. Your household version is smaller and quieter. Move waste away from the supply. Keep the lid in place. Notice what enters the bowl. The logic requires no modern laboratory, only repeated observation. Clean and used water remain separate because the household can observe the consequence immediately. The reason is visible within a day. Rinse into the stored water, and the stored water is what you drink tomorrow. The remaining water is divided between the night and early morning. You inspect the jar's base, check the cover, and set the carrying strap nearby. The strap will be needed again, and leaving it where someone can find it prevents an empty vessel search before dawn. This is not heroic preparation. It is the kind that keeps households functioning. In a city dependent on stored rain, routines become infrastructure too. Knowledge lives in where the vessel stands, which path is safer, which source appears clearer, who can carry, and when a repair must be reported. Such knowledge is hard to excavate directly, but the built water system would have demanded it. Repeated knowledge can be quiet, local, and essential, even when it leaves little direct trace. What the household knows about its own supply is not written anywhere and would not survive the century. The basins survive. The judgment that made them work does not. Outside, the last light lies across the paved courtyard. The slope that carried storms is almost invisible again. A dry surface can conceal its wet season purpose, just as a full jar can conceal the distance it traveled. You now know the city through both. Tikal did not ignore its lack of a dependable river. Its inhabitants reorganized the landscape around seasonal rain, joining monumental architecture to catchments, reservoirs, sediment controls, filters, and household labor. The answer is earned not by a single magnificent basin, but by the ordinary continuity between a cloud, a plaza, a channel, a reservoir, a vessel, and a meal. Dry stone, stored water, and household labor remain parts of the same seasonal arrangement. The courtyard's last light makes the hidden slope visible only through what it once carried. In this light you can just see where the surface falls away. By tomorrow it will read as flat again. Before the household settles, you carry the empty rinse bowl to its place and wipe the few drops from the floor. The main jar remains covered. Your immediate goal is complete, and the white has become food, drink, clean tools, and a reserve for morning. Beyond the doorway, Corriental lies lower in the darkening landscape, holding what remains of the rainy season. The bridge to the next story is already present in the dry channel outside. Someone must clear its sediment, mend its plaster, and test its path before rain returns. The carrier's work ends at the jar. The maintenance worker's work begins where the water first meets the city. The quiet ending leaves one completed task and a clearly prepared next one. The dry channel outside carries the listener forward without reopening the episode or repeating its promise. Tomorrow the channel will be somebody's whole day rather than a thing glanced at on the way indoors. Morning returns to the dry channel, but the vessel is no longer in your hands. You are now an adult worker assigned to a maintenance group near the southern waterworks. A basket rests beside a shallow settling area, and a patch of plaster has lifted along one edge. Your goal is modest and exact. Remove the accumulated grit, repair the damaged surface, and leave a clear route for the first serious rain. The reservoir system developed over centuries through alterations, dams, basins, and redirected flow. It was never a sealed machine hidden beneath the city. Its working parts lay open to sun, roots, feet, sediment, and weather. Today, keeping passage possible begins with kneeling in dust and discovering how much of the city has arrived in one small channel. Your first basket makes the invisible maintenance schedule visible in the most ordinary way. The channel was cut to carry water and spends most of the year carrying nothing at all. What collects in it while it waits is the actual work. You loosen the upper layer with a wooden tool whose exact form is plausible rather than preserved here. Stone and perishable implements both served construction work, but we do not assign a museum object without evidence. The sediment itself is easier to understand. Fine grit gathers where water slows. Leaves break into dark material. Small stones lodge against an edge. During rain, a settling area can keep part of that load from reaching the deeper basin. During the dry season, someone must lift it out. You fill the basket only partway, because wet or compacted sediment becomes ambitious once it is carried. The worker beside you fills theirs too high and corrects the decision before the basket makes the correction for them. A balanced load reaches the dumping place with less drama and considerably more sediment. The tool's exact shape is a reasonable guess rather than a recovered object. The task it performs is not in doubt, because the silt had to go somewhere and somebody had to move it. The cleared depression reveals an older plaster surface below. Tikal's waterworks were built and rebuilt in stages, sometimes incorporating natural drainage, sometimes reshaping it. Excavation shows sequences rather than one clean blueprint. A basin could be enlarged, a dam strengthened, a channel redirected, or a floor renewed as the city changed. That history matters because maintenance workers did not inherit a finished invention. They inherited layers of previous choices. You run your hand near the cracked edge without pressing it. The break follows a place where water once found weakness. Repair must tie new material to the old surface, and the runoff must not be given a fresh seam to pry apart. Every older surface beneath the crack records another generation answering a similar problem. The channel has been resurfaced before. Cutting into it is a short lesson in how long this particular argument with the rain has been running. The basins grew through staged construction and modification, rather than one build. Each generation inherited a working system and a maintenance obligation in the same breath. A second worker brings crushed material for the plaster mix. Lime production required heating limestone, a labor and fuel cost that the finished white surface does not display. Water is added sparingly. Too little leaves a mix that will not spread. Too much creates a thin paste that travels wherever gravity prefers. You stir while another person cleans loose grains from the crack. The team has no need for a speech about engineering. Each action states the principle. Clean the base, prepare the mix, press it into the break, smooth the surface in the direction the water must travel. The city-wide network depends on small gradients, so a careless ridge can become a private dam with excellent confidence and no authorization. The plaster must become part of the slope, not merely cover the damage. A repair standing slightly proud of the surface will hold water behind it for years, patiently and invisibly, until somebody wonders where the flow went. You press the fresh plaster into place with a flat tool and then with careful fingers along the margin. The repair is not decorative. Its surface must shed water rather than hold a shallow pool that collects grit. Across Tikal, paved plazas and courtyards were slightly canted to guide rainfall. At the temple and palace reservoirs, large architectural catchments fed central storage. Here, the route is narrower, but the same partnership with gravity applies. Rain is allowed to fall wherever it will. The built surface decides what happens next. You smooth the patch, side along the channel, and remove a lump that would have sent the first flow sideways toward the path. A smooth line now gives the coming water one less reason to wander. Water takes the easiest available route with complete indifference to intention. The only reliable instruction is the surface itself. Farther downslope, a retaining wall crosses an old drainage line. Research at the Temple Palace Hidden Chain shows dams and modifications that transform natural runoff into managed storage. Some reconstructions include vertically arranged outlets or sluice-like controls. The masonry supports deliberate regulation, but the perishable operating pieces have not survived. You therefore inspect the stone opening without pulling an invented wooden gate from the past. What can be said is enough. Workers could slow, redirect, or release water through built features, and they had to keep passages from clogging. The exact order of commands remains unknown. The sediment packed into the lower corner does not need a command to announce its presence. Stone preserves the root more readily than it preserves the hands that operated it. Dams and control features remain legible in the ground. How they were opened, closed, or watched during an actual storm is largely reconstruction. You and another worker scrape the packed cornering turns. The work is cramped, and elbows must be negotiated before tools can move. Above you, the dam appears solid. Up close, it is a collection of joints, surfaces, repairs, and pressure points. Water adds weight quietly, then tests every weakness at once. Dry season inspection offers the advantage of seeing places that will later be submerged or difficult to reach. You clear roots from one seam without tearing the larger vegetation at the reservoir margin. Plants can protect soil, but roots can also disturb masonry. The useful response is not to declare vegetation either friend or enemy. It is to manage the particular edge in front of you. Close inspection turns a massive wall back into a set of manageable tasks. Nobody maintains a waterworks. People maintain corners, seams, and lips. And the waterworks is what those add up to. Environmental DNA from Tikal reservoir sediments has identified diverse trees around these water bodies. The evidence supports a greener, urban core than older images of bare basins might suggest. Trees offered shade and could help stabilize soil, while leaf fall and roots created maintenance needs. Researchers cannot reconstruct a complete planting plan or prove that every species was deliberately placed. You return at once to the worker's decision. A young shoot in the channel is removed. A larger tree above the stable bank is left alone. The scene is plausible because water managers everywhere distinguish between growth that holds a margin and growth that blocks a root. But the exact Tikal rule is not preserved. Careful choice at the margin protects both the built edge and the living cover above it. Roots can hold a bank together and can also work a joint apart. Where the line falls between the two is judgment, and the Tikal version of that judgment is not preserved. The team carries the baskets to a dumping place beyond the runoff line. Putting cleared sediment directly beside the channel would allow the first storm to return it, an efficient arrangement only from the sediment's point of view. You spread the material where it will not wash straight back. The work leaves a dark stripe on your forearm. Heat has risen, and the plaster patch must be kept from drying too quickly at its thinnest edge. A damp cloth or light mist is plausible, but the exact curing practice is uncertain. You shade the repair briefly with a woven mat, Then move to the next section while the surface firms. The relocated silt now lies outside the easiest path back into storage. A second trip would otherwise undo the clearing before the first useful rainfall reached storage. Silt dumped inside the runoff line is not removed, only postponed. The walk to the far side is the difference between clearing the trap and rearranging it. At Corriental's inlet, the maintenance problem changes. Quartz and zeolite found in ancient sediments indicate that incoming water passed through deliberately placed filtering material. The minerals likely came from near Bajo de Zucar, roughly 30 kilometers away. Transporting them required planning beyond the reservoir edge. The filter was not simply local sand scooped from the nearest patch, yet the exact frame that held the material has disappeared. It may have involved woven containers, mats, or wooden supports. You can handle replacement mineral in this plausible reconstruction, but you do not pretend to know the shape of a lost box. Your practical task is to keep the incoming route from bypassing the prepared bed. Mineral evidence anchors the reconstruction, even where wood, fiber, and routine have disappeared. Quartz and two kinds of zeolite were found together in the sediment here. That combination is not something the basin collects by accident. The two zeolites are clinoptilite and mordanite, and coarse crystalline quartz was found with them. Together they make a filter bed rather than a natural deposit. You lift a handful of coarse quartz-rich material and let the smaller grains fall back. A filtering layer must allow water through while slowing particles and exposing the flow to zeolite. Too fine a barrier can clog. Too loose a path can channel water around the useful material. The ancient deposit demonstrates repeated presence, not a perfectly preserved maintenance manual. You level one area and pull displaced stones back toward the inlet. The work is patient rather than spectacular. A filter does not improve water by looking impressive. It does so by remaining where the flow actually passes, which requires someone to notice when a storm has cut a shortcut. The corrected bed makes the intended route easier than the accidental one. The material remains coarse enough for passage and ordered enough to prevent an easy bypass. Water will always prefer the gap beside the filter to the filter itself. Most of the work is closing that preference off. Another member of the group checks the upper catchment for fresh animal disturbance and fallen branches. The city includes people, dogs, wild creatures, and dense vegetation, all capable of adding material to runoff. You follow the channel uphill, removing what can be moved by hand. The broad plastered spaces beyond will contribute much more water than this narrow line, but a small blockage can redirect an early flow before the main current arrives. Water management is therefore partly anticipation. Workers read stains, sediment fans, broken edges, and the shape of last season's deposits. Those traces show where water behaved differently from the plan. The repair begins with accepting that water has already submitted its own report. Each removed branch preserves space for the larger flow that has not yet arrived. The catchment reports its own condition if anyone reads it. Fresh disturbance and fallen wood mark exactly where the next runoff will decide to misbehave. At midday, the team rests in shade and shares food brought for the work. The reservoir surface is lower than it will be after rain, and the exposed margin shows several bands of dampness and growth. One person points toward a place that needs clearing. Another notes a crack on a higher plaster lip. The conversation is not preserved, but coordination is unavoidable. No single worker can inspect every catchment, carry every basket, produce every batch of lime, and watch every outlet. Tikal's water system joins specialized knowledge with collective labor. Authority may have organized some work, especially around central facilities, but the daily success of the repair still depended on people recognizing one another's tasks. Shared food gives the group enough time to compare what each section still needs. The repairs only work as a set. A cleared trap above a blocked channel has accomplished very little, so the crew spends the rest deciding what connects to what. After the rest, you return to the cracked lip. The patch applied earlier has begun to set. You feather its edge into the older surface, reducing the step that runoff would strike. A small bowl of water becomes a test. You pour from above and watch the thin stream cross the repair. It hesitates at one spot, circles a grain, then continues toward the settling area. The grain is removed. The test is repeated. There is no need to imagine a formal inspection ceremony. A visible trial with a limited amount of water is a practical way to see whether the slope works, and it uses less of the stored supply than discovering the problem during a storm. The second test shows a cleaner line and a more dependable fall. Testing with a bowl now costs a bowl. Testing during the first storm costs whatever the storm decides. Using stored water to test a repair feels wasteful and is the cheapest test available. A bowl now, or an unknown quantity during the first real flow. The water reaches the cleared depression and slows. Fine particles settle while the upper flow continues. This is the result the team wants, though one bowl cannot predict a heavy downpour. The basin's geometry and the archaeological sediment record show the intention to manage silt. You mark a weak edge for more work. Farther away, another group may be repairing a plaza surface or clearing a reservoir stair. The whole system is distributed across the city. Its reliability comes from many repairs that do not look connected until rain links them. A mist crack upstream can become a muddy reservoir downstream. A cleared trap can spare days of later dredging. One bowl makes the sediment trap's purpose visible without spending the reservoir's larger reserve. The water slows, drops what it carried, and moves on lighter. That is the entire mechanism, and it works only if the room to slow down has been kept clear. A scholarly comparison describes some Mayan reservoirs as constructed wetlands. Plants and aquatic organisms can take up nutrients, support microbes, and help still water remain usable. The model offers a useful way to think about maintenance, but it is not a license to populate every Tikal basin with the same botanical arrangement. Direct Tikal evidence supports vegetated margins and particular trees. The exact aquatic community in each reservoir remains less certain. You therefore clear a mat of decaying leaves from the inlet while leaving rooted margin plants beyond it. The action reflects the known need to balance water quality, erosion, and obstruction without claiming a universal ancient recipe. The strongest version of the argument remains conditional, local, and open to further evidence. Workers can act on that cautious model without claiming that every ancient reservoir followed it. Plants and living things in a basin can help manage what accumulates in it. They can also let it go stagnant if the maintenance stops. The comparison is a proposal about how some reservoirs may have functioned, not a recovered design. It is useful precisely because it can still be tested. Clouds build briefly in the afternoon, but do not release rain. The workers look up because the sky controls the schedule even when it declines to participate. The channel is nearly ready. You carry one final basket of sediment away and return with clean material for the patch edge. The stubborn part of the job is not the largest crack. It is a narrow depression that continues to hold a spoonful of test water. You smooth it, test again, and watch the small pool disappear into the intended flow. There is quiet satisfaction in a correction that no one will notice once the surface is covered by moving water. Preparation continues beneath a sky that offers no guarantee about when the work will be tested. The rains will come on their own schedule and will not send word. Everything has to be ready before there is any evidence that readiness was needed. The team walks the route from catchment to basin. At each turn, you ask not a dramatic question, but a practical one. Where will the first runoff strike? Where will grit settle? Which edge could overflow? Which roots should remain? Archaeological research can identify dams, plaster floors, catchments, and sediment controls. It cannot recover the full sensory skill of the workers who maintain them. Your careful inspection is therefore plausible staging, not a named historical event. Yet somebody had to translate construction into operation. A channel left uncleared is only an archaeological feature waiting to fail. A channel watched and repaired becomes part of a living city. The inspection joins separate repairs into one route. That rain will later travel as a whole. Walking it in order is the only way to see it as the water will. Each repair looked finished on its own. Near the reservoir, the route passes a stair or access point where movement could be observed. Museum scholarship has suggested that central water access could be restricted or supervised through architecture. That does not prove a single rule across Tikal. It does show that waterworks were embedded in social space. Your maintenance group leaves tools where they can be collected and reports the damaged section to the person coordinating work. The fresh patch is visible enough that carriers can avoid stepping on it. The system depends on cooperation between those who repair and those who draw water. One person's shortcut across wet plaster could create another person's long afternoon. Social coordination is as necessary as plaster because people must protect one another's work. Movement near the central water could be observed, and the shortcut across setting plaster is the kind of small thoughtlessness that costs somebody else a morning. You make a final check of the filter inlet. The coarse mineral layer sits level, the side path is blocked, and loose leaves have been removed. Corriental's evidence is exceptional because the filtration material survived in sediments across a long span. It shows that Tikal's water management included attention to quality as well as quantity. Still, no filter made every reservoir safe, and no city could remove every risk. Later contamination in central basins demonstrates the limits of storage under dense use and drought. Your work does not guarantee perfection. It improves the odds that the next rain enters cleanly and remains useful longer. The final adjustment keeps incoming water in contact with the material placed to improve it. Quality improves through attention, though no ancient system could promise water free from every danger. The filter was used across a very long span, from early centuries into the late Classic. Something maintained for that long is being maintained because it works. Water leaving here was better than water that had not passed through. Better is not the same as safe, and that distinction was available to nobody's certainty at the time. The sun lowers while the plaster loses its wet shine. You gather the tools and lift the empty basket. The channel now offers a continuous line from upper catchment to settling area. The basin edge is clear. The repaired surface slopes in the intended direction. These are small achievements, but water systems are made of small achievements repeated before they are urgently needed. Tikal's reservoirs were not passive holes that happened to contain rain. They were maintained landscapes, shaped by construction, sediment removal, surface renewal, vegetation management, and observation. The workers' payoff is a route that will function when the sky finally changes. Tools, baskets, and tired hands leave behind a water route ready for use. No monument records the tired walk home, yet the prepared channel preserves the result. The city's inscriptions had other subjects. What this crew did survives as an absence of damage, which nobody commemorates. Before leaving, you pour one last bowl at the highest repaired point. The stream travels over pale plaster, crosses the patched seam, slows in the cleared trap, and reaches the basin without carrying fresh grit. You do not applaud it. The water has completed a very short journey and would become impossible to work with if praised too early. Instead, you set the bowl inside the basket and walk toward the living city. The next story waits beside a kitchen near Palace Reservoir, where stored water becomes food, washing, waste, convenience, and responsibility. The short test completes the crew's ordinary goal and lowers the story toward indoor work. The empty basket and the cleared path mark a complete handoff from maintenance to domestic use. The channel is as ready as hands can make it. Whatever happens next belongs to the weather. The kitchen stands near Palace Reservoir, close enough that access to stored water is unusually convenient. You are an adult worker responsible for preparing a meal, cleaning the vessels that must be reused, and keeping today's refuse from entering tomorrow's supply. The archaeological evidence supports a kitchen at the reservoir edge, serving residents of the central Acropolis, but it does not preserve your name or menu. You begin with 2 jars of water and a line of bowls awaiting attention. The first jar is reserved for food. The second must cover washing and other work. Someone has placed a dirty plate beside the clean stack, a small administrative innovation that you correct by moving it before the idea gains followers. Nearness saves distance, but it also places every kitchen action close to the shared catchment. The kitchen sits close enough to stored water that fetching is barely a journey. Everything spilled, rinsed, or discarded here is also close to where the city keeps its supply. Smoke from the cooking fire gathers under the roof and moves out toward the open side. You measure water into a pot, stopping while there is still room for grain and stirring. Central access saves carrying distance, but it does not remove the need to choose how water is spent. The reservoir beside the kitchen belongs to a larger catchment, receiving runoff from plazas, buildings, and busy surfaces. Water that is convenient to draw can also be easy to foul. The cook's practical knowledge begins with separation. Food water stays covered until used. Wash water remains in another vessel. Refuse has a destination away from the clean jars, even if generations of activity did not always keep waste beyond the runoff line. Measuring remains necessary because convenience is not the same thing as abundance. Being near the water changes the walk and not the quantity. The dry season is the same length for everyone. You rinse a bowl with a small pour and wipe it rather than filling it. The used water becomes cloudy with food residue. It cannot return to the storage jar, and you carry it toward a place where it will not immediately drain back to the reservoir. Excavation found a midden beside the ancient kitchen, and sediment chemistry indicates that organic material entered Palace Reservoir over time. Phosphate rose in late classic deposits, consistent with food waste, washing, and dense human activity around the water's edge. The evidence does not identify each careless pour. It records accumulation. Many ordinary actions, each too small to seem important, can change a shared source when repeated for years. The residue in the bowl is small, yet the reservoir receives the effects of repetition. One rinse is nothing. The same rinse repeated by many hands across many years becomes a measurable layer in the sediment. A second worker grinds maize while you tend the pot. Water softens and joins ingredients, carries heat, and loosens material stuck to the vessel wall. It also limits how much can be prepared. A household farther from a reservoir would pay a greater cost in carrying. People working near the central precinct had shorter access to some basins, though the exact rules and entitlements remain uncertain. Architecture could make approaches visible and controllable. Political authority was connected to the ability to provide and manage water, but the evidence does not reveal a single citywide ration schedule. Your kitchen has convenience. That convenience is a social fact, not proof that every resident's jar was equally near or equally full. Different distances create different burdens, even when every household depends on the same rainy season. Some residents draw water a few steps from the door. Others walk down and climb back with it. The season does not distinguish between them. The meal thickens, and you add another measured pour. Outside, light strikes the reservoir surface. Water in a central basin carries the reflected forms of nearby buildings, but it also receives what those buildings shed. Large plastered plazas and roofs directed runoff efficiently. During storms, pigments, dust, food waste, and organic debris could travel with it. In later sediments from palace and temple reservoirs, researchers found high mercury levels, likely connected in part to cinnabar used in elite and ceremonial contexts. You cannot see that metal in the water. The modern finding tells us that an impressive catchment can collect unwanted material as efficiently as rain. Your next task remains visible. Keep ash from the open pot and move the dirty bowl away. Runoff carries the history of the surfaces it crosses, not only the rain that began it. What lands on stone leaves with whatever the stone was carrying. That is true of a courtyard, and equally true of a plaza. You lift the pot from the strongest heat and set it where the food can finish more gently. The work requires water of usable quality, but boiling is not a universal answer. Some toxin-producing cyanobacteria leave compounds that heat does not reliably remove. Sediment evidence indicates blooms in temple and palace reservoirs during parts of Tikal's history, especially under dry conditions when water receded and nutrients concentrated. This does not mean every jar from every year was poisonous. It means water quality varied by reservoir and period. Corriental's lower contamination signals and mineral filtration make its pattern distinct. Tikal's people lived with a network of sources, not one uniform liquid. Water quality therefore belongs to a time and source, never to a single label for the city. Later sediments from the central basins carry mercury, phosphate, and traces of toxin-producing cyanobacteria. Corriental's record looks cleaner. Both belong to the same city. Corriental sits further from the monumental core and shows fewer contamination indicators. Proximity to the center carried costs nobody at the time could have measured. The kitchen worker in this scene cannot know the future sediment report. You know the water's smell, color, surface, and recent history, as people around you have observed it. Perhaps one source is avoided when a bloom is obvious. Perhaps another is preferred when available. The evidence cannot recover a complete decision tree. It is important not to turn uncertainty into ignorance. Communities dependent on reservoirs for centuries would have accumulated practical knowledge about visible quality and seasonal change. It is equally important not to give that knowledge powers it did not have. Invisible mercury and microbial toxins could remain beyond ordinary detection. Experience could reduce risk without abolishing it. Practical knowledge and unseen risk can exist together without canceling one another. The city's long experience could guide choices while leaving some hazards impossible to recognize. Nothing available to this kitchen could reveal what the sediment reveals. Custom carried real knowledge, and also could not carry what it had no way to detect. Long experience is a real instrument. It is also blind to anything that does not change color, smell, or taste within a lifetime. You cover the finished food and turn to the washing. A scraper removes what can be lifted without water. Only then do you pour. This action is plausible rather than directly documented, but it reflects the pressure to conserve a carried and stored resource. The bowl is cleaned enough for reuse, and the wash water is set aside. Some water might serve a second low-risk task before disposal. Archaeology rarely catches that sequence. What it does catch is the relationship between kitchens, vessels, reservoirs, and chemical traces. A living city leaves residues because people eat, wash, discard, repair, and repeat. The title story's water reaches its consequence here, not in an abstract discussion of urbanism, but in hand deciding whether one more rinse is necessary. The preserved sequence is incomplete, but the pressure to conserve remains physically clear. One more rinse or not is a decision made hundreds of times a season. The reasoning behind any single one of them is gone. Beyond the kitchen, other uses compete quietly. Plaster must be mixed for repair. Clay needs moisture. People need to drink. Food needs cooking. Gardens and fields may require water at particular times, though irrigation evidence and reservoir use differ across Tikal's landscape. Perdido Reservoir, for example, has been interpreted in connection with nearby agricultural land, while other reservoirs serve drinking and mixed purposes. You do not borrow an irrigation system from Caracol or a spring-fed aqueduct from Palenque. Tikal's evidence is sufficient on its own. The city divided water through geography and use, with basins occupying different elevations, catchments, and social settings. Several reservoirs and work areas divide demand across a landscape rather than one central container. The landscape distributes water among drinking, work, and cultivation without erasing uncertainty about each allocation. Fields, craft, and cooking all draw on the same seasonal store. How the city balanced them is visible only in outline. The city needed water for drinking, for craft, and for growing food, and the same seasonal store answered all three. Balancing them was a standing decision rather than a fixed rule. A messenger from another work area asks whether a jar can be spared for plaster. You check what remains after cooking and washing. The answer is a smaller vessel, filled only part way. The exchange is plausible, not preserved as a written request. It shows the consequence of limited supply. Work is scheduled around what water can be obtained without endangering food and drinking needs. A monumental building may appear to represent unlimited command, but its plaster was made through countless measurements like this one. Water moved from reservoir to jar, from jar to mixing bowl, and from bowl to wall. Each transfer lost a little, and required someone to decide that the use was worth it. The smaller jar leaves, and the covered food water remains protected beside the hearth. Plaster needs water, and plaster protects the surfaces that collect water. Spending some now is how the next season's supply gets caught at all. The worker carrying the plaster water leaves by a path above the reservoir. You watch long enough to see the jar remain steady, then return to the kitchen. Near the water's edge, refuse has gathered where earlier workers found the walk convenient. You lift a basket and begin moving the freshest waste farther from the drainage line. The midden itself is archaeological evidence of repeated disposal, not of one day's reform. Your action is a plausible response to an obvious problem. Rain falling on food waste can carry nutrients down slope. The easiest dumping place is not always the safest place. Urban water care therefore asks people to accept a longer walk now in exchange for cleaner runoff later. Convenience must be balanced against the downstream cost carried by the next storm. The path above the reservoir is longer. It is chosen because the shorter route ends somewhere the runoff would find it. The basket is not heavy, but its contents encourage a prompt destination. You set it beyond the direct catchment and cover loose material with dry earth. We cannot claim this exact sanitation practice at this exact kitchen. The important grounded movement is removal from the water's immediate edge. Behind you, the reservoir remains calm. Its surface gives no simple account of what lies dissolved or suspended within it. Archaeology has made the water more legible by reading sediment layers, but the story returns to your hands. You wash them with a controlled pour over a separate area, using enough to clean and not enough to create a stream back toward the basin. A longer disposal walk protects the nearby water edge from the most immediate return of waste. Distance is the only treatment available. Where waste is put matters as much as how carefully the pot was covered. As afternoon advances, the central acropolis casts longer shade. The kitchen's position shows how water and authority could meet. People associated with rulers and central administration had ready access to nearby reservoirs and to the labor that maintained them. Scholars debate how strongly elites controlled urban water and how access worked beyond the core. Reservoirs can concentrate power because they concentrate a necessary resource, yet distributed basins and household practices complicate any picture of absolute command. Your day offers the cautious conclusion. Central convenience was real. Unequal distance was real. The exact rules are lost. Water management was political because decisions about construction, maintenance, and access affected who carried farther and who worked beside the source. The kitchen worker's short route and another resident's long route belong to the same unequal geography. Living beside the water is a real advantage and was probably not distributed by chance. The details of who was near and while water access and the central infrastructure were connected to authority, what that meant for any individual household's daily allocation is not something excavation can settle. The clean bowls are placed upside down, so dust is less likely to settle inside. You check the remaining food water and cover it. A thin layer of ash is swept away from the jars. These actions have become quieter than the morning's reservoir journey, but their consequences continue. One uncovered vessel can be fouled. One waste pile can feed runoff. One neglected crack can send sediment into a basin. No single mistake destroys a city, and no single good habit saves one. Tikal endured through accumulated practices and faced strain through accumulated pressures, including drought, land use change, population demands, political conflict, and water quality problems. The evidence does not support a one-cause ending. Care becomes visible in what is removed, covered, separated, and left ready for later use. The bowls dry upside down because dust settles. Small habits like this are most of what protecting a supply actually consists of. A brief shower would be welcome, but the sky remains dry. You listen instead to the ordinary sounds of the work area. Grinding, footsteps, a vessel set carefully on stone. The reservoir level cannot be raised by wishing, and the kitchen cannot stop using water altogether. Sustainability here is not a permanent state. It is a balance renegotiated each season. For centuries, Tikal's inhabitants adjusted agriculture, forest use, construction, and water storage. At times, the system proved resilient. At other times, pressures exceeded what maintenance and rainfall could answer. The story stays with the present task. There is enough water for this meal, enough for the essential vessels, and enough left covered for those who will need it later. The day ends through completed motions, rather than through a claim that the balance will last forever. Enough was used and enough was kept. That is the whole account for today, and tomorrow opens the same question again. You carry the last basket of refuse away from the runoff path. On the return, you pause at the reservoir edge without drawing more water. The surface is lower than the stain on the bank. Trees and other vegetation stand around parts of the margin, their presence supported by environmental DNA. They soften erosion in some places and contribute leaves in others. The water landscape is neither pure nature nor pure architecture. It is a worked meeting of stone, soil, plants, weather, and human use. The kitchen is part of that landscape, because what leaves its doorway can eventually enter the catchment. Your responsibility ends not at the pot, but at the path of the discarded water. Each established routine lowers one avoidable risk, while leaving the larger sea-snow uncertainty intact. The routine cannot make the rains arrive. It can only make sure that what already arrived is not spoiled on the way to being used. Multiple pressures accumulated at Tikal across its history, and the evidence does not support one tidy cause for what eventually changed. Tonight's routine is one thread among many. Back inside, the meal has been portioned. The main vessels are clean enough for tomorrow, and the wash water has been used and removed. The practical goal is complete. Stored rain has become food without all of it becoming waste. The payoff is quieter than the title answer, but closely connected. Water inside Tikal supported cooking, craft, construction, gardens, households, and central authority. Its convenience was uneven, and its quality could decline under heavy use. Every draw created a new obligation to protect what remained. The city lived not only by catching water, but by deciding, again and again, what the water should do next. The basin, plants, kitchen, and path remain joined by whatever the next rain will carry. The worker sees one connected landscape where modern categories might separate kitchen, reservoir, plants, and waste. Kitchen, basin, margin, and refuse path are one continuous surface to anyone who lives on it. The divisions belong to later description. Evening settles near Palace Reservoir. You place the final covered jar against an interior wall and leave the cleaned bowls inverted. Outside, the waste has been moved beyond the immediate runoff line. Nothing about the scene is complete in the archaeological sense. The record is residue, architecture, vessels, and inference. Yet the human thread is clear. A worker receives water, uses it, sees the consequences, and alters the next action. From the kitchen edge, attention turns toward the season itself. Channels have been cleared, plaster has been patched, and the city waits for rain to find the routes prepared for it. With the vessels settled, the worker leaves no immediate task unresolved. The quieter ending keeps consequence intact, while the reservoirs remain part of the next season. The vessels are settled, and the water is covered. Nothing further is required of this evening. The first sustained rain arrives after a day of darkening air. You return to the maintenance crew. Now standing above the repaired channel as drops strike pale plaster and turn it gray. The work has one immediate purpose. Watch the first strong runoff, remove obstructions before they grow, and guide the water towards storage. A light shower might reveal only damp patches. This rain gathers into motion. Roofs, courtyards, plazas, and sloped surfaces begin sending thin streams toward their lower edges. The city does not receive the storm evenly. Each catchment has its own area, condition, and route. Workers spread along the path, close enough to signal when a flow changes and far enough apart to see different parts of the system. The first darkening drops connect the finished repair to the weather it was made to receive. Everything cleared, patched, and smoothed over the past days now becomes either correct or visibly not. The rain is the only inspection that counts. At first the water moves as separate lines. One follows a plaster seam. Another crosses a broad surface and collects grit from a shallow hollow. You use a broom or branch bundle, plausibly reconstructed, to push loose leaves away before the stream carries them into the narrow inlet. The repair made in the dry season holds. Water crosses its feathered edge without turning aside. The test bowl predicted the direction, but the storm supplies far more force. You watch for undercutting where a new plaster meets old. A dark line appears and then steadies. No breach opens. The worker below raises an arm to show that the settling area has begun to fill as intended. Runoff now reveals every subtle decision hidden in the dry surface. Lines of water find the falls that feet could not feel. The slope has been there all along, waiting to be demonstrated. The first sediment arrives before the clearest water. Dust accumulated over dry months, ash, leaf fragments, and fine soil all move when the surface is washed. The settling depression slows the muddy front. Heavier grains drop while water continues toward the reservoir. You clear a clump from one corner so the basin can use its full width. This is the moment when maintenance becomes visible as consequence. Had the trap remained full of old sediment, the new load would have passed onward. Had the channel crack remained raised, runoff might have cut another route. Preparation does not control the rain. It gives the rain a path that the city can use. Sediment settles where the crew made room for it, preserving deeper capacity below. The first flow always arrives dirtiest, carrying whatever the dry months left on the surface. Room to drop it is the reason the basin stays deep. Sediment control features are archaeologically visible. Precisely how they were tended through a storm is reconstruction built on what the deposits imply. Across the higher plazas, canted surfaces gather water from spaces that seemed almost level in the dry season. Their slight slopes now announce themselves through moving sheets. Runoff travels towards selected edges, then enters channels leading to reservoirs at lower elevations. The Temple Palace hidden chain demonstrates how architecture and natural drainage were joined over time. Dams and basins transformed an older flow line into storage. Exact gates and operating routines remain partly reconstructed, but the large pattern is clear. Tikal's builders made rain descend through a sequence rather than vanished at the first low point. You stand within that sequence, watching one link accept the storm. Moving water makes the city's long-developed design legible in a single storm. Runoff joins older construction to current repair, making the long walkerworks history active again. Surfaces built centuries apart are all shedding into the same basins tonight. The system was never finished, only continued. Connected basins at different elevations spread the same rainfall across different uses. Water held high could serve the center, while water further out served other needs. A shout from upslope is practical rather than alarmed. A branch has fallen across a side channel. You climb through the rain with another worker and lift the lighter end, while the other person frees it. Water has already begun to pool behind the obstruction. Once the branch moves, the pool releases in a sudden brown ribbon. You step aside and let it pass toward the settling basin. The channel edge remains intact. The action is plausible staging, but the need is grounded in open waterworks, exposed to vegetation and storms. A citywide system could not be left unattended simply because its slopes were carefully designed. The released pool rejoins the intended route, and the workers continue downslope. The branch is placed beyond the channel, where it will not immediately return with runoff. A single branch can turn a working channel into a spreading pool. Moving it takes a moment now and would take much longer later. At Corriental's inlet, water reaches the prepared mineral bed. It spreads across coarse quartz and zeolite rather than cutting through the side road you blocked. The exact ancient frame is gone, so you do not see a perfected box with known dimensions. You see water passing through a maintained zone supported by the sediment evidence. Fine material slows. The flow emerges less clouded before entering the reservoir. Filtration cannot make every incoming stream pure, and this system belongs specifically to Corriental. Its significance lies in deliberate attention to water quality over a long period. The worker's significance lies in keeping the flow where the filter can act. Maintenance turns the archaeological mineral layer into a functioning part of this particular rain. The water emerging from the prepared inlet shows the value of keeping the route aligned. The mineral bed is useful only while the water is actually obliged to pass through it. Alignment is the whole difference between a filter and a pile of gravel. The material came from perhaps 30 kilometers away. Every storm that bypasses the bed wastes both the mineral and the journey that delivered it. Rain strengthens and then settles into a steady rhythm. Reservoir margins begin to darken above the previous water line, Vegetation bends under the drops, and exposed soil and a stable edge holds. Environmental DNA shows that trees and diverse plants grew around Tikal's reservoirs, but their exact arrangement remains uncertain. Here, the known and the plausible meet without confusion. Roots help bind some margins. Leaves and branches can obstruct others. Workers respond to the condition of each place. You remove loose debris from the inlet and leave the rooted bank undisturbed. The water rises by an amount too small to celebrate, yet large enough to notice against a marked stone. The rising mark stays modest, steady, and closely watched by the people beside it. Storage rises slowly, even in good rain. Elsewhere in the city, other basins receive different runoff. Temple and palace reservoirs collect water from dense monumental and residential catchments. Corriental receives flow through a less central setting and its distinctive filtration zone. Perdido has been connected to nearby agricultural use. These differences prevent the city from becoming one diagram repeated 5 times. The network gains resilience from multiple sources and uses, but it also gains complexity. One reservoir may be clear while another carries more sediment. One may be convenient while another is farther but preferable. The rain links them as parts of Tikal, yet it does not erase their separate histories. Variety protects the city from one uniform weakness, while demanding knowledge of each source. Knowledge of separate basins matters, because the nearest source is not always the best source. The basins do not fill with the same water, or in the same condition. Knowing which is a form of local expertise nobody wrote down. The later record from Temple and Palace is not the record from Corriental. One city held several different waters at once, and residents had to know the difference. The crew moves downstream to inspect a retaining wall. Water presses against the upper side and passes through the intended opening. You watch the joints for a cloudy leak that would reveal moving soil. None appears. A small overflow lip begins to carry excess toward the next section. The masonry does not need to be imagined, as modern concrete to be effective. Stone, packed fill, plaster, and repeated repair can hold and direct substantial water. The archaeological profiles show construction episodes because workers return to strengthen what earlier workers built. Tonight's storm joins that long history as another test, one that the current repair survives. The inspection remains focused on seepage, pressure, and the small signs that precede damage. The wall's quiet performance depends on repairs completed before pressure returned to its joints. A wall under load reveals what a drywall conceals. The crew reads seepage and small movement rather than waiting for anything obvious. Dams and retaining features required repeated construction and maintenance across centuries. Pressure returns every season and does not remember last year's repair. Near the central precinct, rainwater runs from architecture associated with authority into reservoirs that supported central life. The connection could reinforce political power because rulers and administrators helped organize large works and stood close to their benefits. Yet water also depended on labor distributed through the city, including the people clearing branches in rain and carrying jars in heat. The system was neither only an elite symbol nor only a household improvisation. It joined decisions at several scales. You do not pause to resolve a scholarly debate. You press fresh packing into a small erosion notch, while another worker diverts the strongest trickle around it. The worker's repair belongs to an institution, but its success still depends on wet hands at the wall. The water leaving the monumental center is managed by the same practical attention as everywhere else. Authority organized the system. It did not operate it. The notch holds long enough for the flow to weaken. Rain has begun to move eastward, leaving a softer fall over the catchment. The Cephalin Basin is nearly full of new grit, but it has done its work. Tomorrow it will need clearing again before the sediment dries hard. Maintenance follows the storm just as it precedes it. You mark the task by placing a tool where the morning crew will see it, a plausible signal rather than a claimed ancient rule. Below, the reservoir surface is wider than it was at dusk. The rise is modest, but the city does not require one storm to solve the season. It requires enough storms to arrive and enough prepared surfaces to keep what they give. The next clearing is already visible, eking this rainfall to tomorrow's quieter labor. Every storm both fills the basins and gives the crew their next list. The two arrive together and always have. The system develops through exactly this cycle. Rain arrives, surfaces are tested, damage is noted, and the next dry season becomes a work list. Workers walk the route one final time as the last runoff continues after the rain. Water still drains from roofs and broad plazas, carrying the storm's remainder toward the basins. You check the repaired seam, the cleared branch site, the filter inlet, and the wall. Each has moved from plan to performance. The payoff is now visible. Rain becomes urban water only because the city has been shaped and intended to receive it. Catchment, channel, sediment trap, filter, reservoir, carrier, kitchen, and household form one long path. No part alone is Tikal's answer. The answer is the connection, maintained across seasons by people whose names mostly do not survive. Water continues moving after the clouds thin, completing routes that began far above the basin. The rain stops before the runoff does. For a while, the city keeps draining quietly into its own storage. The crew puts tools beneath shelter and stands for a moment where the reservoir can be seen. Water touches repaired stone and reflects a dim opening in the clouds. Somewhere uphill, a household vessel waits under a roof. Tomorrow, carriers will return to the paths, and kitchens will measure what is drawn. For now, the seasonal preparation is complete. The storm has crossed the city without opening a major breach along this route. The workers leave the basin rising quietly, not as a symbol of mastery over weather, but as stored rain made useful through attention. The living action resolves in observation, a final look at water resting where many hands prepared a place for it. The final image keeps the workers present beside the result of their completed preparation. The basin holds what the season sent in the place prepared to receive it. There is nothing further to adjust tonight. The rain has passed and water remains on the stone in thin, familiar lines. It rests in the shallow places, moves through the cleared channel, and gathers where the plaster slopes downward. The repaired edge holds its smooth shape. Grit lies in the settling hollow rather than farther below. Along the path, the marks of wet feet soften as the surface darkens evenly. Nothing new is asked of the scene. Water follows the route already prepared, and the stone receives it without noise beyond the last small trickles. Under the household roof, the ceramic vessel stands in its known place. Its cover is settled over the narrow mouth. A smaller bowl rests beside it, clean and inverted. The carrying strap has been set down within reach, no longer pressing against a shoulder. Water inside the jar is still, held between the walk already completed and the work already done. The doorway frames a damp courtyard, and the household keeps its ordinary arrangement around the stored supply. Across the paved surface, the last runoff passes through the same gentle slope revealed by the storm. A leaf turns once at the edge and comes to rest before the open channel. The pale plaster is darker with water. The patch, the old surface, and the narrow seam now share one quiet line. Farther down, the settling place holds the sediment it was cleared to receive. The route remains connected from stone to basin, with no need for another instruction. At the reservoir, the surface reaches the repaired margin and lies against it. Reflections shift slowly beneath the clearing sky. Trees and rooted edges stand where they stood through the rain. The inlet is open. The coarse filtering place remains beneath the path of water. A jar, a channel, a basin, and the broad catchment belong to the same settled image now, each holding the result of attention already given. The household grows quiet around the covered vessel. Outside, wet stone loses its shine little by little, while the reservoir keeps the rain that reached it. The carrying path, the cleared channel, the shaded doorway, and the still water remain together without another task beginning. Rain rests in the city. The jar rests in the household. The last small movement fades across the basin, and the stored water is left undisturbed.